So a very warm welcome to all the participants. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Gokhale, for giving the talk today in our sustainability seminar series. So we'll start with a brief introduction of the center. So Dr. KIRAN Center for Sustainable Development at IIT Gandhinagar was established back in 2019. And we have been doing some research and outreach programs that relate to sustainability. We have 5 main focus areas that are water, pollution and waste management, climate change, energy, and natural resources, wildlife, and ecosystems. So today's talk is related to the this 5th focus area that I mentioned, that is natural resources, wildlife, and ecosystems. So this seminar series, we bring prominent scholars and professionals who are working in the area of sustainability. We have been doing this seminar series since last 1.5 years. We started with online, and before going online, we had a few physical events when we did not have COVID. But since we are having this pandemic, since then we have started going online. And this has also given us the privilege for participants across India and even abroad to join in this seminar series. So yes, I would now introduce a bit Dr. Chavinath Pandey, who is going to moderate the session. He is a retired IFS officer, and he is a professor of practice at Civil Engineering Department in IIT Gandhinagar. He retired as the principal chief conservator of forests and the head of Forest Force Gujarat, and he worked on different forest related with the Forest Department of Gujarat during his career experience, and he has a vast experience related to field execution and protection of forests, tribal development, and related areas. I kindly request Dr. Chavinath Pandey now to take over and kindly introduce Dr. Yogesh Gokhale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faguni. First of all, I welcome Dr. Yogesh Gokhale to the IIT-GN and to the Center for Sustainable Development that we have as a part of the institute. And on behalf of the entire IIT-GN community, and particularly the Center for Sustainable Development, I once again welcome Dr. Yogesh Gokhale to this webinar series, which has various aspects related to sustainability. And to introduce Dr. Yogesh Gokhale, he is a senior fellow with the TERI. TERI, as you all know, is earlier it used to be Tata Energy Research Institute. Now it is called the Energy Research Institute. I hope I'm right, Dr. Yogesh.
The Energy and Resources Institute.
The Energy and Resources Institute. Yeah. And Dr. Gokhale has worked extensively in the field of natural resource management, which includes biodiversity, which includes forests. In fact, he has worked not only on forest regulations, forest policy, but also on forest management issues, the evaluation of habitats, and he has got a number of publications, and the whole list of his activities has already been circulated to all of you. So, so in brief, we can say that he's the person who would be talking about how the biodiversity is actually governed in our country. See, we usually feel that biodiversity is just a theoretical subject, and we wonder what the government is doing, how the governance of the biodiversity is actually taking place. And in this governance, as we will see in his presentation, that in this governance, government is not the only stakeholder. The stakeholders are local communities also, various NGOs also, various institutions also. It will be interesting, I believe that it will be interesting to see that how whatever we discuss in the academia about biodiversity and natural resources, how all these things find place in our governance. It will be a matter of particular interest. I'm also very happy to point it out that in his discussions, the biodiversity occupies the central stage, because the very topic of his presentation today is biodiversity governance in India. And I was just talking to Dr. Gokhale, and he would also be sharing his experiences with natural resource management and the field learnings and all. So we are looking forward, Dr. Gokhale, to a very interesting and interactive discussions. And after the presentation is over, we will have question answers. And I will request that if you have any questions, kindly keep on sending to me in the message box, so that we can, the moment the presentation is over, we can start with the questions. And how many time we have, Faguni, this?
We have around 1 hour in total. So Dr. Gokhale can present his presentation in the first 30-40 minutes, followed by Q&A of 10-15 minutes with the participants.
Sure. So Dr. Gokhale, that is what Faguni says, and we will have to abide by that. So
that is fine. We can be a bit flexible too. That is, yeah.
So in order that we have enough time for question answers, we all request you that to conclude your presentations in 35 to 40 minutes. Okay. So
Sure.
So now the floor is yours. You can share your screen, and with this brief introduction, I request Dr. Yogesh Gokhale to continue with his talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Pandey and Chabi. Sorry, Falguni. And without any ado, I will start sharing my screen, because we need to also abide by the timelines. So as Dr. Pandey had mentioned about, we would be discussing about biodiversity governance and also the governance of other natural resources in India. So let me give you a little bit of status at this point of time. So, first let me clarify that I would be little biased towards terrestrial ecosystem, and terrestrial biodiversity, and won't be touching much on with respect to the aquatic and marine ecosystem biodiversity per se. Nevertheless, for many of the issues what we talk about, those would a lot of issues also would be applicable to marine and aquatic biodiversity. So at this point of time, if we see, then we have around 24% of the area which is stabilized as forest and tree cover for past almost more than a decade now. Then at the same time, we are a mega diverse country with 4 global biodiversity hotspots. I would say that mega diverse country is a political term as well as a technical term, because there are consortia at Convention on Biological Diversity. Then there are consortia within the UNFCCC, that is Climate Change Convention, under the name of mega diverse countries, like-minded mega diverse countries. And then at the same time, there are countries which are having very high biological richness are also categorized as mega diverse countries. Then to justify that how we are mega diverse, we have more than 900 protected areas, then more than 2 lakh sacred groves, that is the forests which are protected due to the faith. Then we have more than 1 lakh joint forest management committees and more than 2.50 lakhs biodiversity management committees across India. Then very interestingly, we have more than 30 crores of people of our population that is directly dependent on forest resources for subsistence. So it means every day they take out things from forest to survive, for their survival. It's a huge number, and it's a huge aspect. And then at the same time, if you see whenever there is a forest survey report that comes out every 2 years, it gets published, then there is always especially for past 7-8 years, there is a consistent debate that even though we have stabilized forest and tree cover, we are depleting forest resources per se. And that's true. And forest survey report doesn't hide those numbers. One needs to get into the details, because even this year also we have increased open forest area, and we are at the same time certain good forest areas, those have been more or less stabilized. But medium forest increase in the open forest from medium forest category, that is a concern, which is a concern of degradation. So, and which is the obvious reason there is a continued economic pressure on forest, which is responsible for it. Now, that's a little government perspective. If you see the community perspective, then we have different types of community systems which we have in terms of biodiversity protection, which is at genetic level. Like we have a number of rice varieties. So at some point of time, we had something like 5,000 rice varieties in India, or rather even today, NBPGR has a collection of more than 5,000 rice varieties. Then we have very interesting different breeds of animals like Kadaknath chicken. Then we have different breeds of cows, like for the Gir cow is a very famous from Gujarat. Then Tharparkar from the drier parts. Then which are conserved because of their various aspects. Like Kadaknath chicken is conserved because it is necessary to use that chicken for sacrificing to the gods in many parts of tribal regions in India, especially central India. Then we at the species level, almost all ficus species are conserved. Then we are at the ecosystem level, we have conservation practices like sacred groves, sacred forests, sacred wetlands, even sacred grasslands, which are bugyals, which are the alpine meadows in the Himalayan areas. Then there is a practice which is generally not recognized as a part of conservation practice, which is called totemism, where large number of tribal communities, most of the tribal communities, they they consider that they have been derived from a certain species, especially in Chotanagpur Plateau, that is Jharkhand and parts of Chhattisgarh. And there is no much information that is analyzed for this, but a guesstimate suggests that under this totemism practice, there could be around 500 species that at the individual level local communities are protecting. Then there are a number of other secular type of conservation practices. Like there are in Nagaland, there are more than 300 community conservation areas. Then there are Nistar forests in parts of central India, the area which used to be earlier central province and Berar, that is parts of Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh and parts of Vidarbha in Maharashtra. Then there are a number of models of restoration, rejuvenation that individual communities or organizations, those have demonstrated, like Aravari rejuvenation model by Tarun Bharat Singh, by the famous Rajendra Singh of the Paniwale Baba. But then we must see all these in the backdrop of how these things have evolved. These things have evolved over a period of more than 150 years. So like when the first time we had a state control in 1855, where the Britishers declared teak as the state property. Teak, that is Tectona grandis, the teak, sagwan jisko bolte hai, gum. Then we had subsequent to that, we had forest legislations in 1865, then revision in 1878, and then finally we stabilized at 1927 as Indian Forest Act, which is basically not a forest act, but an act to control the transit of timber. Then post-independence, we had first in 1952 forest policy, which provided substantial benefits for commercial use of forest resources, but also recommended to have 33% of forest cover. And the landmark 1988 forest policy, which gave importance to ecological balance as against the commercial use from forest resources, so and the sustainable use of forest resources. After that, we had few legislations as late as 2006, which are directly linked with the forest biological resources as well as other natural resources and local communities. Why all these plethora of legislations, those have come into force? Because we have a number of provisions in our constitution which are important to understand as well as consider, and these provisions recognize involvement of individuals, involvement of state, involvement of entire country in a sense, in terms of conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use as a right. like Article 48A state that the state shall endeavor to protect and improve the environment and to safeguard the forests and wildlife of the country. So the state has to take a call on it. Article 40 talks about conceptual aspects of bringing Panchayati Raj. So Panchayati Raj, it means the local communities are not, it's not only the state's responsibility, but they need to work with local communities. And then as an individual level, Article 51 AG talks about it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, and wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures. So there are a number of such kinds of important provisions from Article 48, 40, 51A, and 21, which are important with respect to where the Constitution of India provides us such rights. But the landmark judgment, or rather landmark constitution amendment, is 73rd Amendment, which has paved way for strengthening the decentralization of empowerment of Panchayati Raj institutions and Gram Sabha. And that has now become the way in terms of management, governance, and utilization of our biological resources. So if we see the governance of biodiversity, then we have this huge structure in place where we have number of acts, we have policies like forest policy, environment policy, agroforestry policy. Then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 6 acts which are directly influencing the governance of biological resources, biodiversity, natural resources. You say in whatever way, but it actually means biological resources, biodiversity, forest resources, and so on. And there are a number of institutional mechanisms like ministries at the central level, and generally forests. Forest is a concurrent subject. So the MOEF, that is Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, doesn't have a role in implementation, but they have a role in regulating things. So they make regulations, and the states are responsible to implement as per the decisions. And then we have at the local level biodiversity management committees, then the frontline staff of the forest department, the state biodiversity boards, number of other committees formed like joint forest management committees, and also the Gram Sabha, and not to say less, but talk about much in terms of judicial activism, which influences the governance of biodiversity in India. So what I would quickly run through is that I will run through some of the legislations for which what they provide. So like as I said, the Indian Forest Act 1927, it doesn't define forest per se, but it basically it's a law that regulates the transit of forest produce and the duty leviable on timber and other forest produce. So but yes, it did have a very significant provision, that is village forest, that is section 28, where a category never used by any state till 2006. So except I would say the exception is one panchayats in Uttarakhand. So where there was a provision to include community, or rather hand over areas to community for management. But it was never considered under 1927 under Indian Forest Act 1927 for various reasons. Then we have Wildlife Protection Act, where the number 733 should not be there, it should be more than 900. So this is in 1972 this act came into being because of the importance of various wildlife conservation that was at very high. Mrs. Gandhi was very keen about things. Then we have people like Salim Ali, who influenced these decision-making processes extensively and highlighted the importance of having protected areas. And for the management and protection of protected areas, this act came into being. But then by 2001, it was very evident that to manage the human-wildlife conflict, we needed different mechanism of conservation, and that's why 2 new provisions of conservation reserve and community reserves, those came into being. And we do see a number of results, especially like we have now more than 200 community reserves in Nagaland which are recognized, and a number of other positive aspects linked to biodiversity conservation. Then Forest Conservation Act 1980. I think if one asks the question that which is the most important entity which has been responsible to save India's forests, then there is no other than Forest Conservation Act 1980. Because post independence, when there was rampant deregularization of forest areas, that was regularized through through this legislation. And then today we see Campa, which has gathered more than 50,000 crore, the authority, and then now every year annually we are getting the interest from that 50,000 crore to conduct the compensatory afforestation program. That is because the Forest Conservation Act enabled net present value mechanism, and then the land which is getting diverted for non-forestry purposes, it needs to be compensated through by providing this amount for afforestation to the Campa authority, and then further upon the states undertake those active afforestation measures. So then the Environment Protection Act, which is also another important aspect. It is actually a very robust legislation, but because of the poor institutional mechanism that it has, the effectiveness of this mechanism is not visible. But the very interesting part that it has come out with, it has defined ecologically sensitive areas. Those are known, like for example, the Doon Valley, Dahanu, Mahabaleshwar, Pachgani, parts of Aravali's, Numaligarh. I think Mount Abu or Girnar is also one of the ecologically sensitive areas in Gujarat. So now there is an opportunity to understand how sustainable these areas are with respect to academic perspective, and to provide a concrete suggestions with respect to the Environment Protection Act. Then wetlands are also governed under Environment Protection Act through Wetland Rules 2010. Then we have a devoted Biological Diversity Act 2002. It is a direct outcome of our commitment at Convention on Biological Diversity, where and we should be thankful to Convention on Biological Diversity, because of which we got this act. We were compelled to work on such kind of legislation, and this is basically a legislation to provide to make a provision for access and benefit sharing from the commercial use of the biological resources. Many of you might be aware about the turmeric controversy or neem controversy from on biopiracy issues. So this particular legislation also has a very important feature of documenting people's biodiversity register through biodiversity management committees. So we may have a more discussion during the Q&A session. As I said, that ABS regime, the access and benefit sharing regime, is a very critical aspect for research, for R&D, for medicinal plant sector, and many other aspects of sustainable use, also the livelihood aspects of large number of, like I said, 30 crore people are dependent on forest resources. So out of that, almost 10 crore people, they collect the non-timber forest produce from forests. So they are the collectors, but the end users are of different types, and the commercial utilization of these resources, and also the associated knowledge aspect, that it's the way we deal with this knowledge aspect, commercial use of traditional knowledge, that's in a very nascent stage in the country at this point of time. But we have a mechanism in place where we can actually look at how the traditional knowledge is not misappropriated in process of commercialization. So this ABS regime is very critical for that. On similar lines of the Biological Diversity Act, we have Protection of Farmers' Right and Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act, where we deal with a type of biodiversity which is totally in the private domain of farmers, and encourages innovation by having number of plant varieties. Just to mention, in late 70s, there used to be a very famous watch company in India called HMV watches, HMT watches, and Hindustan Machine Tools. And a local innovator, Mr. Khobragade from Chhattisgarh, he innovated a rice variety which is extremely popular even today, and he named it as HMT rice variety, and he offered freely to local communities. Today, the majority farmers in Chhattisgarh and Maharashtra, adjoining Maharashtra, they use number of such varieties. Mr. Khobragade lived in those part, and he very recently, few years back, he died. But till the end, he remained an innovator in terms of various varieties of plants. The latest one in this series is the Forest Rights Act, that is, which has provided tenurial security to live and cultivate to the forest dwelling communities. Which now, what had happened when Britishers and subsequent governments in independent India tried to settle the rights of people who were living inside the forest areas, but a large section of community remained deprived of that, and they were always considered as encroachers of those forest areas, and their traditional rights, customary rights, were never recognized formally by the managers, including forest department, revenue departments, and so on. So this act tried to correct those, and in fact, in its preamble, it mentions that it is to correct the historical injustice that has happened to the local communities, the forest dwellers. So it has a lot of importance with respect to the community-based forest governance, because Gram Sabha in Schedule 5 area, that those have come into the center stage of this entire governance mechanism under Forest Rights Act. Large areas at this point of time, around 10 lakh hectares in India, those are controlled by the Gram Sabhas in India. So, but what happens that the if you see at the local level, when we start looking at the governance, then there are large number of committees which are having working on the same area. So like in the same area, you will find Joint Forest Management Committee. In the same tribal area, you will get Forest Rights Committee, which is formed for recognizing CFR areas under the Forest Rights Act, where at some point of time there would be formation of Community Forest Resource Management Committee in under FRA. There, if it's adjoining to the protected area, then there is a large possibility of having Eco Development Committee. There would be Biodiversity Management Committee at the Panchayat level. If there is a watershed committee, if there is a PM-KSY program happening, that is Pradhan Mantri Krishi Sinchai Yojana, then there would be a watershed committee. There would be a Conservation Reserve Management Committee if there is a conservation reserve formed. Similar way, Community Reserve. So like that, there are a number of committees which are operational, which are and trying to govern the natural resources, biodiversity, and forest in the area. And this is true for all three Schedule 5 areas, Schedule 6 areas, and non-schedule areas in and you would see that how they are linked with Panchayati Raj institutions. Many of them are not, and some of them are, yes, but the linkage is not that strong, or rather weak, like in case of Biodiversity Management Committee. Now, once the BMCs are formed, then those are part of the elected body of the Gram Panchayat. But once the new body is formed, the new BMCs needs to be reconstituted, and that process, that updation hardly happens in most of the BMCs. And what happens that there is a minimal requirement of all these local committees which are governing the biodiversity at the local level. They have a minimal requirement. They need office bearers. They need a certain type of documentation to undertake the work. Like in case of joint forest management, they need a micro plan. In case of biodiversity management committee, they prepare people's biodiversity register. Then they need a transparent financial management where they need to maintain accounts, and then they need to report to different departments rather their parent departments. So these are the basic requirements. So if you see let me give you the quantum of these things. So we have over more than 1 lakh JFM committees which are having more than 23 million hectare of forest in India under the control of JFMCs. But what is the status at this point of time for JFMCs? JFMCs remain as the dormant institution, and they have, except for states like Maharashtra, is mainly Maharashtra, they do not have direct connection with Panchayati Raj institutions. So for none of the Gram Panchayats recognize JFMC as a mechanism to manage the biodiversity. But at the Gram Panchayat level, there is Biodiversity Management Committee, which is responsible for conservation of biological resources, which also includes forests. But yeah, so there is a direct conflict of how JFMC should function and how biodiversity management should function. Then if you see the orders of JFM formation in various states, then and the purpose for which they are formed, they are formed for protection of forests, prevent any encroachment, then control grazing, assist state forest department for smooth functioning, and protection of wildlife, ensuring none of the beneficiaries under JFM follow JHOOM. So JHOOM is a very I would say profane word for JFM committees and even the forest management in India. Then the state forest department, what is it supposed to do? Provide guidance, ensure benefits that JFM is directly the benefits go to the local communities, take actions when provisions of forest acts and rules are violated. So department has a more regulatory role in case of joint forest management. If you see the biodiversity management committees, then there are established rules and guidelines. But the way they are formed in Schedule 5, Schedule 6 areas and non-schedule areas, the way their formation is different, and hence their functioning is different. So there is a defined composition, how many percent should be reservations for women, SC, ST, and so those details are there, which are important in democratic systems. But then there is a varying tenure of BMC. Say, for example, in case of some of the state, it's a 3-year tenure, whereas in case of some of the state, it should be 5 years. Ideally, it should be coterminous with the Gram Panchayat body, because it's a committee of Gram Panchayat, and these are some of the issues which are critical in terms of governance, because it creates a confusion at the local level. And since we are not aware what needs to be done when there is a new Gram Panchayat that comes in, how BMC is going to reconstitute and function, there is poor clarity in this. Then it's also an issue how it should associate itself with other agencies like JFMCs, Eco Development Committees, Conservation Reserve committees. So this interaction, documentation, it's lacking. We have the huge gray area. This is in terms of biodiversity governance. Now, another aspect of biodiversity governance, like out of more than 2,69,000 biodiversity management committees, majority are formed are in past 2 to 3 years because of the Supreme Court uh, insistence. Yeah. And so there is a huge issue with respect to awareness and capacities of these committees. Um, there is a availability of more than 2,28,000 biodiversity registers, but we have had interaction with the chairman National Biodiversity Authority, and NBA confesses that the quality of these registers is a serious issue because of the capacities of the biodiversity management committees. Um, and then on top of that, now we would be having community forest resource management committees and PESA committees, which in the Schedule 5 area. So look at the overlaps of governance at the local level, which is a very huge concern of conflict as well as the confusion. Now, also there is a very interesting comparison of what Gram Panchayat, how it should function and how Gram Sabha should function. And especially there are list of 28 subjects which are under 73rd Amendment under devolution of power. Those have been transferred at the PRI level. And some of the issues like firewood, non-timber forest, social forestry, grazing, these are the issues which are passed on to the PRI bodies, the Gram Panchayats and Gram Sabhas, to work upon and take decision. So at the ground level, what we see, there is an overlapping functions and responsibilities of institutions of governance. There is an observed conflict and contradictions of Gram Sabha and Gram Panchayat based governance. There is a need of governance model for sustainable forest management and enhanced livelihood through convergence of existing provisions and with respect to ease of implementation. And then there is a need to consider national and state policies, regulatory paradigm, judiciary orders, and identify lacuna from the field for improved governance of sustainable forest natural resource management. So we did a lot of countrywide consultations in past around 5 to 6 years on various aspects, including Forest Rights Act implementation, then governance of community forest resource rights areas, and tried to work upon a model of 3 models for possible governance of forest, biodiversity, and other natural resources. So this is the for non-scheduled areas where the Gram Sabha still remains the main body, but Gram Panchayat is the executive body. So Gram Panchayat would have a number of committees. So there will be only one committee which would be looking after natural resources, forest management, and biodiversity. Here we consider Maharashtra as a very interesting model because in Maharashtra, the Joint Forest Management Committee is established at the Gram Panchayat level, and the same committee with the approval of Gram Sabha can function as biodiversity management committee. So there is this replication of institutions at the ground level that is reduced, the multiplicity is reduced. And then if there is a single committee, then they need not prepare PBR and microplan and any other things. So they can prepare one document which is also can be used as biodiversity register. So it should have chapterization which would cater to the requirement of PBR as well as microplanning as defined in as been done in case of JFM, Joint Forest Management. It should be sent to the Gram Sabha for approval. With approval of Gram Sabha, the Gram Panchayat should be the executive body in any way in non-scheduled areas. And then the most important aspect is the financial part, where there should have 3 bank accounts. One is the under BMC, that is for a local biodiversity fund account. Then one with the in collaboration with the in partnership with the State Forest Department, because they would receive they are open to receive number of funding from central as well as state governments. And then one should be a Gram Sabha account, where any other revenue that Gram Sabha earns from its efficient management, it should have right to retain money and also spend as per for the village development purposes. So the Gram Panchayat would be open to receive money from central as well as state governments and various other schemes for the implementation of the plan that is been developed by the Natural Resource, Forest Management and Biodiversity Committee at the local level. So this we prescribe for the non-scheduled areas. On similar lines, in case of the Schedule 5 areas, Gram Sabha comes to the center stage because of the provisions in PESA, provisions in Forest Rights Act, and the similar functions of planning, documentation, then PBR, such kinds of things are done by the single committee. Those are approved by the Gram Sabha, and then similar way the functioning, the implementation would take place through village panchayat, and it would be entitled to receive funds from state as well as center for its management plans, and would have similar bank financial management as we explained earlier. The last one, that is for Schedule 6 areas, which are Schedule 6 as well as similar situations like Arunachal or say Nagaland, though it's not a Schedule 6 area, these conditions are similar to other Schedule 6 area states like Mizoram and Manipur. So the local village level institution or village council, it is in the center stage of the functioning. There will be a committee of natural resource management, forest management and biodiversity management, which is linked with this traditional institution, which would do the functioning of the resource planning, biodiversity register, then CFR, community forest resource areas management, get it approved from the village council, receive the funding as from the state and center, maintain the bank, have the financial management in the similar manner. Here the separate independent bank account will be at the level of village council or the similar or equivalent traditional institution, and that is how there will be a restriction in terms of multiplicity of institution. So in the end, what I would say that there is an evolving trajectory from state control against community control over the biological resources. There's a growing need for retaining the sovereignty of the biological diversity and associated traditional knowledge. There is a depleting status of depleting natural resources due to market demand, and we need new monitoring instruments like certification, ABS regime, and through local institutions at this point of time. So I stop here and I welcome you all the questions, and I again thank the center for giving me this opportunity for presenting this. Thanks a lot.